Thank you. That's fine. Okay. We welcome you this beautiful Lord's Day. Every day is the Lord's Day. And we're really happy that you're here, and especially that Steve Messer is here. Ooh. Okay. This thing is alive. So, whoa, maybe. Okay. I guess I'm the guinea pig to see what it's, well. Would it be better to be up at the pulpit? But you're the professor. You probably like it down here better, I suppose. I don't know. Well, as I came to know a little bit more, what? Closer to the mic. Oh, okay. Is that more like it? Okay. Wow. I'll be glad when Steve is up here. But as soon as I got to know more and more about Steve Messer, I was really impressed. And one of the things when he got his doctorate, his early right-on professor job at this black college in South Carolina, and in a black, in a black college, and our interest in race relations and everything. And it's just one thing after another. And then in the book club that we're together in, I'm sure you're in here for a treat from Steve Messer, and his wife Betty is here, and so we're just thankful for this time. And I hope this mic works better for you than it does for me. I don't like it at all if this is the way it's working. Gary, is there hope that, well, maybe it's sounding better now, but Steve, good luck.
All right, we'll give this a whirl and see if it works. If not, I can move up to the pulpit. How's that sound? Lift it up. How's that? Is that better? Okay. All right. Good. Good. Well, thank you for that introduction, and most of all, thank you for asking me to share on this topic today. Like many, and perhaps all of you, I have spent some time since retirement, and Betty and I retired in 2018. So I've spent some time looking back at my life. Doing so seems like a requirement, or at least a common condition for those of us at this stage of our existence. As I've peered back at my 35 years of teaching at the college level, the question that came to intrigue me the most is, what was the most important educational experience for me as a college professor? What molded me the most? What had the great impact? And as I look back, I remembered a number of key educational experiences. For example, geometry, sophomore year in high school, first time that math made sense to me. First time. And a lot of other things fell into place after that too, most notably algebra. But that was an important moment for me educationally. And then as an undergraduate at Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois, the junior history research seminar, which convinced me that I could actually write history. It was grueling, but it was a wonderful experience using primary sources and writing a paper and defending it. And then in grad school, and we went to Florida State University, go Noles, Florida State University, and I had this wonderful class with a strange title. It was called Death in the West. And it was looking at death in the context of Western civilization. And that class became really important for me educationally because I developed my doctoral dissertation topic coming out of that class. And so I've had all these and many more important educational experiences. But as I reflected on this question, I kept coming back to my experience, my 3 years teaching at Voorhees College, now Voorhees University, in Denmark, South Carolina. And I kept coming back to that as clearly and far and away having the most important influence on me and my career. So it was my first full-time teaching experience. I was still ABD, all but dissertation, coming out of Florida State. And I got this job teaching at this historically Black college, Voorhees College. And it was 3 years that really changed my life in some very significant ways, and certainly was foundational to the professor that I would become. So let me, I'm going to share some sort of connections there. But before I do that, let me share just a little bit about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities in general, and specifically about Voorhees, because Voorhees has a really interesting history as well. And I must say, this morning as I came in, Grace stopped me and told me that she may well be related to the people who actually, the Voorhees family from New Jersey, who gave money to help purchase the land that Voorhees University was founded on. So, I mean, hats off to your family, and the legacy is ongoing. It really is. So anyway, HBCUs. There are about 100 HBCUs in the United States today. And most of them were formed after the Civil War. At the end of the Civil War, when slavery was officially abolished by the 13th Amendment, historians estimate that the literacy rate among former slaves was about 10%. So education obviously was a key issue for the former slaves as they started their transition into freedom. And so many of these schools, these HBCUs, were started because basically, as former slaves, they had no access to the schools that existed. No access really even to primary education at that time. And also in the South at this time, where most of the former slaves resided, the public educational system was pretty weak in general. So these HBCUs started as a way to counter this discrimination and to provide education as part of this transition from slavery to freedom. And most of these HBCUs that exist today actually started as what we would call primary schools, and then developed into secondary schools, and then continued developing into the equivalent of junior colleges and then four-year schools. Not all of them have that sort of trajectory, but many of them, including Voorhees, did. So again, providing this education. And as you're probably aware, there are a number of very famous alums of HBCUs, including our Vice President, Kamala Harris, including Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, Spike Lee, for those football fans among you, Jerry Rice, Doug Williams, and the music folks, Lionel Richie, and you could just go on and on. So HBCUs have contributed mightily, not only to the life of African Americans, but to the life of this country. Now, Voorhees is really interesting. Voorhees was founded in 1897 by a woman Voorhees was the first HBCU founded by a woman, Elizabeth Evelyn Wright. And she was a graduate of Tuskegee University, Tuskegee Institute at that time, one of the HBCUs, and most famous for being founded by Booker T. Washington. And so she was a graduate, and actually at Voorhees, they have the recommendation letter from Booker T. Washington in the school archives. He recommended her for this. And so she was from South Carolina, well, originally from Georgia, but kind of grew up in South Carolina. She came back to South Carolina dedicated to education for all. That was the thing that drove her in her life. And so she tried to start schools in other places in South Carolina, and numerous of these institutions were burned to the ground as opposition to educating African Americans at this time. But she persevered. And in the mid-1890s, she showed up in Denmark armed with her deep Christian faith and this commitment to education, and particularly the commitment to the Booker T. Washington approach to education. And so by 1897, she had to overcome skepticism of her because of her being a woman, and she overcame that. She also overcame more violent oppression from some local whites, and actually developed some white allies that helped protect the fledgling institution from additional violence. She died in 1906 at the age of 34, and but by that time, the school that she had founded in Denmark Industrial Institute, was on pretty solid ground. And later goes on to be renamed Voorhees Institute because of the money the Voorhees family gave to help get the school started, and then continued its journey to Voorhees College and Voorhees University. So again, fascinating history. And it's a history that was very, very important at Voorhees when we were there in terms of sort of framing what we were up to in teaching at this institution. So I started teaching there in 1985. Betty started teaching in 1986, and we were there for 3 years before we moved on. And although 3 years was perhaps not a long time, the influence of those years is very, very deep on me, and also on Betty as well. So what I would like to do is sort of share some vignettes, some moments, some scenes, if you will, from my experience at Voorhees, in order to illustrate how that experience molded me as a professor. The first vignette, the fall of 1985, my first day teaching at Voorhees. I walk into this classroom, and there are 55 African American faces looking at me. And I introduce myself and say, "Hi, I'm here to teach African American history." Okay, you laugh, and I'm sure many of them did as well, because here's this white guy standing at the front and saying essentially, "Okay, this is a class about your history. Here we go." And it was fascinating to me, and it started this process for me, because I came to Voorhees. As I mentioned, ABD, all but dissertation. And my dissertation was on attitudes towards death in colonial Massachusetts and South Carolina. Okay? Well, for those of you who've gone through grad schools, you know that you got to come up with something original. And nobody was working on death, or very few people were working on attitudes towards death. So anyway, I showed up, but I had to teach African American history. Among some other history courses as well. I mean, I was the history department, right to left, Steve Messer. And the fact that I had to teach African American history changed me dramatically, because it became my passion. It became how I would self-identify in terms of my field in the academic world. I came in as studying colonial America and basically white colonial America, and left identifying myself as teaching African American history. Now, how did that happen? Well, I learned a lot very quickly. When you're a professor and you have to teach a class and you have very little preparation, the panic mode sets in. And so you just read and read and read and can testify to how many hours and hours and hours I'm reading books on African American history to put together this course. But I also learned from observing my environment, observing Voorhees, observing Denmark, really observing South Carolina. Okay, and I learned from my students. Most of them were first-generation college students. And as we developed our relationship as professor and student, they would share their experiences. And they were living this history out. And so they would come to class oftentimes and ask a question about something that had happened to them. And I'll share a couple of examples of that a little later. And that would start a discussion, and we would relate that to the past. So what did I learn right away? What changed me? I realized that history did matter. Now, I knew that, or I wouldn't have dedicated graduate school to studying history. But it came home in a deeper manner, in a deeper way, rather, talking to my students and seeing it mattered to them on a day-to-day basis. So history matters. And again, it became my focus. I taught African American history for 34 out of the 35 years that I was a professor. Missed 1 year in there. It became sort of a staple. Okay, vignette number 2. 2 weeks into my first semester teaching. I'm standing up in front of the class, and they have not done their reading. It's obvious. Okay, I've asked questions, and I'm getting no response. So I look out over the class, and I said, listen, you people need to do your reading. Now, some of you are sort of gasping already because you know what's coming next. Well, I didn't know. And I thought, I'm a professor saying, read the assignment, I said, you people need to do your assignment. Well, after class, a young woman named Ola Daniels came up to me and she said, Professor Messer, we know you probably didn't mean anything, but when you as a white person standing in the front of the room refer to all of us as you people, that has very negative meanings for us. We can see you looking down on us. And so I apologized. But again, it was a powerful lesson I never forgot. Words really matter. The words we choose to use matter. And Ola, God bless her, was very gentle. I don't know, maybe she got elected to come up and talk to me. I don't know. But she did it in such a gentle way, but also a powerful way that stuck with me. And so I learned to be careful about the words that I chose. And I learned to incorporate that into the way I taught history as we went along. So for example, in my career, I would often have discussions with white students, because I taught at a predominantly white institution, Taylor University, for most of my career. And white students would often say, okay, so what term do we use? I mean, it used to be Negro, and then it was Black, and now it's African American. At one point, it was people of color. What term do we use? And I said, well, look, first of all, we'll talk about how the terms have changed over time. But a good rule of thumb is respect people's wishes. Okay? Respect people's wishes. Call them what they're most comfortable being called. Because it's not really your issue, it's theirs. And Ola Daniels taught me that in a powerful way. Another example of words mattering, One day I saw one of my colleagues in the hallway, and we were getting along pretty well. And so I greeted her in the hallway. She's an African American professor of social work, and I said, "Hi, Katie. How you doing?" And she kind of nodded at me. And later that day, she asked me into her office, shut the door, and said, "Look, you need to understand that white people have often refused to use titles for Black people in the South." And so she said, "When we're talking in a department meeting or in somebody's office, you can call me Katie. When you see me in front of students, you need to refer to me as Professor Tyndall." Because she said, otherwise, students are going to interpret that as a lack of respect. So again, another example driving home the importance of how words really matter. Okay, another vignette. They love to have programs at Voorhees. I mean, we had programs for like everything, it seemed like. And these programs were elaborate. I mean, you'd go to one of these programs and you'd get a brochure for the program, a program for the program, and it'd be 2 pages, and there would be so many people involved in the program. Somebody would welcome everybody. Somebody would give an invocation. Someone would stand up and lead us in Lift Every Voice and Sing, which is a song I was unfamiliar with until I went to Voorhees. Wonderful, wonderful song. Okay, and then someone would give the occasion. They would define the reason we were together. And then oftentimes there would be a student who would give a welcome too. And so I'm sitting there looking at the program thinking, we're never going to get this done. Okay, let's get to the speaker. All right. Well, what I didn't realize when I started there is those elaborate programs were really important because it was a way of essentially the African American community asserting the fact that they too could run a program. They could be sophisticated in the way they did a program, and it was important to have as many people as possible experience being in front of that crowd and welcoming that crowd and essentially gaining that experience of leadership. Okay, and so what that really taught me is that context matters. When I started there, I looked at these programs as kind of boring, long, let's get to the point. Well, the elaborate programs were part of the point. They really were. And so again, I learned from that particular experience that context does matter. You have to go beyond just the appearances and dig a little deeper. And so, for example, when I took my African American history class, this became front and center when we talked about, and there's many examples of this, but when we talked about someone like Phillis Wheatley, who was a young African slave that was brought to Boston in the 18th century, learned English, learned Latin, started writing poetry, eventually had a book of poetry published in England, wrote a fairly famous poem about General George Washington once the revolution started. And as I read about Phillis Wheatley, a lot of people who wrote about her essentially said, well, her poetry really wasn't that great. Well, that may be. I mean, her poems were not necessarily up to the level of some of the finer English poets from the period. But the importance here is context. Why is Phillis Wheatley so important? She's so important because she showed a lot of white folks in New England that an African American could be creative, that she could master multiple languages. And she did this as a young girl, by the way, and write poetry. And so again, if you look at Phillis Wheatley and just look at her poetry, she's significant. But if you look at her in context, she's very significant in terms of what she stood for. So context matters. Okay, the next vignette. It's early April. And if you were on the Voorhees campus on a particular day, you would see the faculty in full academic garb walking out a road to a graveyard that was on campus. And you would see the students dressed up following the faculty. This was Founders Day. And it was usually in early April because Elizabeth Evelyn Wright was born on April 3rd. And we would march out there to her grave. We would have a short service and then light a flame on her grave to symbolize an eternal flame, to symbolize essentially her ongoing influence in the Voorhees community. Now, the first time I did this, it was hot. I mean, April in South Carolina could be very warm. I was in academic garb, and I'm thinking, what's going on here? What is this? I mean, it seemed kind of inconvenient to me. But then went through the service at the grave, talking about her life, talking about her faith, talking about her vision for Voorhees. And it became apparent to me that roots really matter. And these were the roots of Voorhees, to honor Elizabeth Evelyn Wright for her courageous actions founding the institution and for her ongoing vision of education for all, greater access to education. Now, that was an important lesson for me because it got me to really thinking about, again, the significance of roots. Now, I'd done some thinking about that, obviously. But in the context of teaching African American history, it sensitized me, for example, to spend a significant amount of time on the African roots of African American history. How the African roots, in terms of family structure, food, clothing, music, resistance, all played a significant role in what I was teaching in the class. And so marching out to that grave on those hot spring mornings was more than just that. It made a point in my mind about the significance of roots. The next vignette. Voorhees was affiliated with the Episcopal Church. And so we had an Episcopal chapel on campus with an Episcopal priest in residence, and morning prayer oftentimes, and services on the weekend, and so on. Well, one particular scene for me that is still very significant is that they had a renewal service there. And a pretty famous English Episcopalian speaker, Canon Dr. Michael Green, came and spoke with a team of young people, and he was dynamic. And what really stood out about this, I mean, first of all, he understood his audience. I mean, when he was talking about getting people to make a commitment, he asked them to come forward and renew the baptismal covenant, because he knew that all the Episcopalians in the audience had been baptized. And this was an idea to get them to sort of renew their faith. So that was impressive. And people did. They went forward. But the other thing that struck me was it was an integrated crowd. And there was precious little integrated activities in this area. But it was whites and blacks listening to him. White and black Episcopalians going forward to renew their faith. And it was incredibly powerful. And for me, that was a reminder that the Spirit mattered. That if we're willing to listen, the Spirit can lead in ways that can be surprising and sometimes dynamically surprising. So again, in this area where the races were separated most of the time, okay, you saw this island of whites and blacks together. Amazing. The next vignette. This is one that has stayed with me in a number of ways as well, and really kind of at the top of the list sometimes. And that is my students' experiences of overt racism. So here's the vignette. I'm standing in front of class one morning, getting ready, shuffling papers like I'm doing now. And one of my students, Margaret Washington, comes up and shows me a piece of paper. And she said, "Professor Messer, do you think we can talk about this today?" And then she explained how she got it. It was a recruiting brochure for the Ku Klux Klan. Yeah, it's entitled The Fiery Cross. It talks about the Ku Klux Klan. And on the back, it says, if you are a native-born, loyal, United States citizen, 18 years old, a white Gentile person of temperate habits, of Protestant faith, and believe in white supremacy and Americanism, please fill in below. And it gives an address and all. So, and what happened to her is she was riding her bicycle from town back to campus, and it was a mile and a half or so. And a group of Klansmen in a van ran her off the road into a ditch. And fortunately, she wasn't hurt. And they threw this out the window at her as they sped off. And so, she comes and I did this big gulp. I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, well, sure, yeah, we can talk about this because it obviously is very relevant to this particular course. We talk about the development of the Ku Klux Klan following the Civil War and how it continued to be active and continues to be active even today. And so we spent some serious time talking about it. And eventually I made copies of it all and gave everyone in the class a copy saying, you need to know your enemy. You need to know what they're saying about you and about what they're trying to do. But the point for me is that just emphasized the point that racism matters. Here's a student of mine being run off the road by this group of Klansmen. Another day in class, I had a similar experience. A young man came to the front before class, gave me a piece of paper and said, "Do you think we can talk about this?" And I looked at it, and the title at the top of the page was 100 N, and it didn't say N, it used the word 100 N jokes. And he'd been walking down the street in Orangeburg, which was about 20 miles away from Denmark, over the weekend. And some Klansmen in robes who were having a parade came up to him and just handed him this sheet and walked away. And so this young man was almost in tears. Basically his point was, how come I can't just walk down the street on a Saturday morning? Why do I have to deal with this? And the jokes were vile. I didn't even repeat them, but they were just vile. And so we talked about it. But again, that made the point to me that my students were dealing with racism, dealing with discrimination on probably a daily basis. And they would come and share that, and we would often talk about it. And what really impressed me about that, as I looked at the way I was going to teach courses, is it was so much more significant to me. I mean, I knew racism existed for sure, but it became so much more powerful when I knew someone who suffered from this, and particularly my students. And so I tried, and I think it's really important to talk about the structural and systematic side of racism. Absolutely. But I tried in my teaching to incorporate ways to introduce my students to individuals who suffered as well, because I think it became much more powerful when you identify with someone that has experienced this. Okay, so racism really matters. And there were a lot of other examples of that as well. The next vignette. One of my students was named Mac Goff. He was a non-traditional student. He was in his early 40s. And this was back in the 80s. This was kind of before non-traditional students became sort of a common theme in colleges. So, I mean, it was everybody else in the class is like 18, 19 years old except Mac. And so one day I'm up at the front of the class lecturing away on the civil rights movement. And Mac raises his hand. And so I called on him and he said, he said, I experienced some of the things you're talking about. He said, I experienced them here in South Carolina. And Denmark is in a pretty rural area. And so he had experienced some of the things that I was talking about. So I said, fine, go ahead and share. And I sat down, and my joke is that's probably the wisest decision I made my first year of teaching, is sitting down and letting Mac address the class. And then I look around, and the students are on the edge of their seats listening to him. First of all, he's an elder, okay, and they respect him for that. But secondly, he actually did time on a chain gang because he was demonstrating for the right to vote in the late 60s. He was actually in Orangeburg, South Carolina in 1968 on the day of the Orangeburg Massacre, when 3 South Carolina State University students were gunned down by South Carolina law enforcement after responding to a peaceful demonstration. And so he was actually there that day and shared about that. And so I'm sitting there listening to Mac and also looking around the classroom. And I was just amazed at how engaged the students were, because they were listening to Mac and they were listening to his voice and his experiences. And this became really important to me because it was a lesson about trying to get away from sort of a standard didactic lecture approach. Not that lectures aren't important, they are, okay? But to try and temper that with efforts to have your students hear these voices, hear the voices of the people you're studying, whether it's having them read an autobiography, whether it's having them read somebody's speech, an excerpt from somebody's diary, a letter that they wrote, whatever. But Mac Goff drove that point home for me. Mac Goff and the students in my class and their response to him. And it was also in that class that the idea hit me that there are a lot of stories out there about the civil rights movement that are never going to be told or rarely going to be told. I mean, when you study the civil rights movement, you don't see Mac Goff's name. And so this became sort of, for me, the beginning of when I started thinking about civil rights movement study tours, taking students, and eventually it was faculty as well, to the South, taking them to sites like in Selma, the Edmund Pettus Bridge, to the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, to sites in the Mississippi Delta, for example, the Medgar and Murley Evers home in Jackson, where he was assassinated on the front driveway. Going to all sorts of places, because I started realizing the power of being there and also the power of listening to voices that were connected to a particular event. So oftentimes when we went to Ruralville, Mississippi, the hometown of Fannie Lou Hamer, we would go out to her grave. And of course, she was a great civil rights hero in Mississippi. I mean, she's we can talk for hours about Mrs. Hamer. But anyway, we went to her grave, and I would have students read passages, biographical and autobiographical passages, before we would go to her grave. And then they would look at the epitaph on her grave. Wonderful epitaph. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. And they would understand that. Though dead, she still spoke, type of thing. So again, voices. Trying to incorporate more activities that will bring voices to my students. And then the last vignette, honesty matters. And I learned this, I knew that obviously, but I learned that in a powerful way, again, after about, 2 months of my first year there in the African American history class. We're talking about antebellum slavery, slavery right before the Civil War. And a student raised his hand and said, Professor Messer, if you had been alive in South Carolina in the 1830s, would you have owned slaves? Yeah. And I thought, wow, I never would have asked a question like that as a student. I'm impressed. And so I thought for a moment, and I said, knowing what I know now, absolutely not. Given my educational level, South Carolina in the 1830s, I probably would have. I would have been a rare person not to have owned slaves. And I said, and again, knowing what I know now, absolutely not. But hey, and that was a moment in that class where we kind of crossed the line. Students kind of relaxed. They asked more questions. And for me, the lesson was, be honest. Don't make something up. If you don't know something, say that. But also be honest that the chances probably were very strong that I would have. And that became sort of a basis for an ongoing discussion of the development of antebellum slavery in South Carolina. So again, all of these vignettes, and there are many, many more that I could share, but all of these vignettes were deeply impactful in kind of molding me at the beginning of my career. And bear in mind, not all of these lessons were incorporated right away. It's not like, boom, I understand all this. I mean, it took reflection. Pardon me? Mistakes. It took mistakes. Absolutely. It took mistakes. But again, I never would have expected teaching at Voorhees to have had that impact on me. I mean, it just changed the direction of my academic life. And it also encouraged introspection on a number of personal issues as well. And it certainly made me a much more effective professor than I probably would have been without that experience. And again, it gave me this passion for African American history, the civil rights movement, and so on. So I hope that this gives you some things to think about, the importance, looking back on influences on your life, but also how moments and words and questions can have a dynamic impact. And you probably all have stories in your own life of that with your careers and your lives as well. So I think we have some time left. If anyone would like to ask questions.
Kindergarten. I went through all the same things that you went through. I resonated with you completely on that. Thanks.
Thank you, Grace. Yeah. And I mean, when people talk to me about teaching, I often say, you've got to do all the classwork and prepare and study what they tell you about education and so on. But also you look for good examples, and you also learn from bad examples, and you learn from your mistakes. Yeah. So thank you.
Until you recognize how you are gracious. And I caught myself, get your cotton pick. Ah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I went, never again.
Good. Thanks, Grace. Anybody else? Yes.
I think you said Betty was with you,
Yes.
also teaching, and I understand she was a Spanish professor.
Yes.
I'm interested in the relevance of that at the time to the students at Voorhees.
Do you want me to? Okay. Well, I mean, Betty taught both Spanish and reading. Okay. And so, I mean, reading was very, very important because a lot of people were underprepared. So reading skills. And they were really kind of starting the teaching of Spanish. They had somebody there who taught French. But as I understand it, nobody had taught Spanish there. So it was sort of the beginning of it. And it was, I think, the sense that the academic dean at that time and some of the leaders were interested in sort of broadening the curriculum. Is that fair? Okay. Yeah.
How many white professors were there? What percentage? I mean, there were two, I know.
I'm thinking about 5 of us that were white, and the campus community with students, faculty, and staff was about 700. And so, yeah, about 5 of us, 4 to 5, depending on the year, that were white. There was a white English professor. There was a white political science professor. It was a really multicultural faculty, though. Predominantly African American, but also some Indian folks who were there, and including some Sikhs as well, who were part of the faculty. We had a fellow from Iran who was part of the faculty, and then somebody from the Caribbean. I can't remember who, but yeah.
Well, your reflection on being a minority, how did that affect you?
Oh, I mean, that was the first. Well, I spent a year and a half in Japan when I was very young, and we lived off base. My dad was in the military, so we lived off base for a while. So I experienced a little bit of what it was like to be a minority there, but I had never experienced anything like this. I grew up in Western Illinois in town of Polo. A number of you know Polo. Yeah, great town, but ethnically diverse it was not, and so. Or racially diverse too, and so yeah, it was a real experience for me, not to be around a majority of people who looked like me. I remember going home one evening after we'd been there a while and looking in the mirror and actually being surprised that I was white, and so I think it sensitized me to the challenges of being a minority. And there were some folks who were uncomfortable around those of us who were white. And also I had the experience of being asked to be on 7 committees my first year there. And I'm thinking, what in the world's going on? And then I kind of realized that for whatever reason, a lot of them wanted to have a white person on the committee. And so, yeah, I mean, it really did sensitize me to that. And the sense of people evaluating you, are you going to fit in? how are you going to fit in to this tight-knit community? So yeah, that was significant as well.
Steve, how would you compare your student structure, I mean, your students as preparation compared with your student preparation at Taylor? Were these kids coming out of good high schools or
Most of them in South Carolina were not. I mean, the academic preparation of Taylor students when we were there was pretty phenomenal. I mean, the average SATs and grade point averages and things like that. But at Voorhees, most of these folks were first generation college students. They were coming out of a school system that was still heavily segregated. I mean, in Denmark, for example, the high school was like over 90% black because as soon as they integrated the schools in South Carolina in the early 70s, an academy was formed outside of town. And of course, it was the reverse. It was well over 90% white at the academy. And so people weren't all that concerned, the white folks in town at least weren't all that concerned about the high school. And so many of the Voorhees students, not all of them by any means, but many of them lacked what we would probably consider adequate preparation. And that's why, that's why Betty was teaching reading. That's why they had developmental math courses as well. And for me, it was very challenging, particularly at the beginning. But I think it made me a much better teacher in the sense that I learned to empathize with folks who didn't have the preparation and to think about how to build that into the course, how to encourage them to build their preparation level as we went through the course. But yeah, it would be a stark difference in terms of preparation. Very, very stark. Even I taught as a graduate assistant at Florida State for a couple of years. And even there, the preparation level would have been better than Voorhees. But again, first generation, and again, resonating with Elizabeth Evelyn Wright's mission of education for all, working with what folks brought. I did have an incredible experience too once when I had this student who stayed for a week and then left. And that happens. And so the end of the week, or the beginning of next week, there's a knock on my office door. I open it up, and here's the student with her mother. And her mother says, "My daughter is the first one in our family to ever go to college. She is going to college. Here's my phone number. If she gives you any trouble, give me a call." And so there was the level of preparation was relatively low. But there was also a sense of pride and commitment on the part of many of the students.
If you were teaching in Florida today, would you have to adjust your curriculum?
Oh, I mean, that's an excellent question. I am very disturbed by not just Florida, but other states as well, that are essentially saying we've got to somehow make white folks feel comfortable when we're talking about the past. And I don't know. I think it'd be a real challenge because on the one hand, is there some way that you can still make the point about oppression and still kind of hew to the letter of that law? Is there some wiggle room in there which would justify you trying to do that and stay because you're going to be somebody who's going to try and teach those issues? Or on the other hand, just saying, it's full speed ahead, and we're going to see if you're going to fire me. You know, I mean, really, I mean, that's a real challenge with that because, for example, I still don't understand how anyone can say that it's a significant lesson to learn that people picked up important skills as slaves. Yeah, well, yeah, some of them, they certainly did because of what they were made to do. And some people were skilled blacksmiths and some people were plasterers and so on, particularly in urban settings. But to even make that comment about slavery is to try and make it seem so much less evil than it was. So yeah, that would be a real challenge. I mean, and the question would be, and I'm sure the social studies teachers and even university professors in Florida now are facing this issue of how do I make this point? And is it more important to stay here and make this point in a way that lives within the letter of the law, or just, you know, and leave and have nobody? Yeah, so that's a good question. I would probably end up being asked to leave. Okay, Gary is telling me to knock it off.
One more question. How would your students, and in the various contexts that you were, when they want to say, we really appreciated that, what would they do?
Well, I took it a number of ways. I mean, sometimes they would just say that. And some of them would say, you know, this is the first time I've really studied African-American history. It was a requirement for every student at Voorhees. It was a graduation requirement. and so sometimes it would be, you know, just verbalizing that. I took it when they started asking these sort of deep questions. I took that as affirmation. Or when the students come up with something like the Klan brochure or the list of vile jokes and want to talk about that, I took that as sort of affirmation in the sense that they felt comfortable enough to do that. So yeah, and then there was a lot of sadness when we left.
But you still didn't answer the question that I wanted to have, because that would give us a clue on how can we show our appreciation for you today.
Oh, well, you've asked some very good questions. And I think that's one way of showing appreciation. It really is. I mean, one of the worst feelings as a professor is to pour your time into a lesson or a lecture or something, and then say, are there any questions? And silence. But I had an approach to that. If I was teaching and there were no questions, and I really wanted a question, I'd go out and I'd sit down. Okay. I'd raise my hand and I'd ask myself a question. And then I'd go up and I'd start off by saying, well, that's a very good question, Steve. Let me address that. So,
isn't he good? Now we have to do the traditional way, don't we? At least to clap or something.
thank you very much.
Thank you for coming.